I was acting like I was.
I know I got a picture.
All right, let's talk about the Residential Rental Agreements Act. This is on page 333, I believe, in your textbook. Yep, 333. So, the Residential Rental Agreements Act only applies, obviously, to what kind of property?
Residential.
Residential. These are specific laws that govern how we rent residential property in the state of North Carolina. Every state has their own version of these laws. One thing you need to remember is that the most protected group of consumers in the real estate industry is always going to be residential tenants. There are far more laws protecting residential tenants than any other group of consumers. You know, even buyers, we don't give this much protection to. Just think about buyers, we at least have let the buyer beware, right? But when it comes to residential tenancies, almost everything falls as a responsibility on the landlord. And remember that you guys, if you get a real estate license, when you get a real estate license, the reason you study this stuff is because you may eventually be what? Property managers. And from the standpoint of the law, the property manager is the landlord. So, all of these responsibilities fall on your shoulders if and when you go into property management. So, a couple of things that are included here. First of all, it's called the warranty of habitability. Basically, a residential property must be maintained. If you're going to lease a residential property, maintenance is always on the landlord. Remember we talked about the gross lease versus the net lease, right?
Yeah.
We said in a gross lease, who was handling maintenance? The landlord. In a net lease, who's handling maintenance? Tenant. So, if we say here that residential tenancies require the landlord to do the maintenance, that's another way of saying that residential tenancies must be what kind of leases? They have to be gross, because the maintenance must be included. That is not negotiable. It is not legal in this state, even if the tenant wants to pay less rent in exchange for not doing repairs. If something is broken, it is not negotiable that it be repaired. Even if the tenant says, I don't care, just drop my rent by $50 a month. That is not a legal discussion to have in this state. Does that make sense for everybody? Mm-hmm. The landlord has to do the maintenance, no matter whether they're charging $1 or $1,000. They have to do the maintenance on a residential property. And if they're not willing, then they should not rent it, because it's the law. So just an example of some of the things that are required. Heat that will maintain 65 degrees. That is a requirement. Working plumbing and electrical systems, smoke and carbon monoxide detectors are required. The tenant has to maintain the batteries in them in most cases, but the landlord has to provide operable smoke and carbon monoxide detectors in the property. This is a good way to get sued. You know, you have a fire start on a property that you rent out, and you don't have smoke and carbon monoxide detectors in there, and something happens to somebody, it is a very quick way to get sued, because the law requires you to have it in there and make sure they're functioning. And actually now what it says is that for all new tenancies now, you have to install the 10-year battery smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors, the one that the batteries are good for 10 years. If it has old ones, that's fine. The tenant can be responsible for changing the batteries, but when you do a new lease, you have to replace them with the 10-year versions. All right? So what recourse does the tenant have if the landlord is not doing what they're supposed to do? If the landlord breaches this lease, in other words, if the property's not inhabitable, that's going to be the #1 reason that the tenant is going to have a claim that the landlord's not doing what they're supposed to do. They're not fixing something, right?
Yes.
The tenant has the right to move out. It's called constructive eviction. It's when the tenant evicts themselves. So constructive eviction is going to be when the tenant evicts themselves. Now notice it says that the tenant moves out and then stops paying rent. Because in North Carolina, the tenant never has the right to just stop paying rent. The tenant can't say, my heat's broken, I'm not sending you the rent until you get over here and fix it. That's not legal. If they're in the property, they should be what? Paying rent. Now, if the landlord doesn't fix something, the tenant can sue the landlord and get a refund of rent that they've paid for a time period when the property was not inhabitable. But they don't have the option of not paying the rent. Does that make sense, the difference there? You got to pay, and then you could go file a lawsuit, and you probably would get your money refunded, but you can never just say, I'm not paying you till you get over here and fix something. Then the landlord has a right to evict you because you are breaching the lease. So always make sure that the tenant pays rent and knows they have to pay rent. There are only two ways that a tenant leaves a property in North Carolina. Number one, of their own free will, and number two, through the summary ejectment process. That's the phrase you need to know, summary ejectment. That's the legal form of eviction in North Carolina, a summary ejectment. It's heard by a magistrate. It's a court action that gets heard by a magistrate. What we don't allow is what we call self-help eviction. Self-help eviction is like shotgun style. You know, you go over there and you get the hell out today. That's not allowed. No changing the locks, no taking their stuff out and putting it up somewhere where they can't get to it, no turning the water off, none of that. None of that. You go through the summary ejectment process. Any of you ever encountered the summary ejectment process at all to know what length of time it takes? It takes 45 days. It takes 45 days from the time the action is filed. And that's pretty much best case scenario. It could take longer. So one of the things you need to remember if and when you become a property manager is that the eviction process is not an easy one or a fun one. It should be your last resort. Remember, I said there's two ways for them to leave. What was the first one? Willingly. Work on that one, because that's going to be the much better route. I mean, let me give you an example of what I mean. Let's say Tidra is a tenant, and I'm managing the property, and she's lived there for 6 months, and all of a sudden she stops paying the rent. She didn't pay last month, and I've sent her notes, and she said, I'm going to pay you, and she hasn't paid. And then February rolls around, and she doesn't pay again. Do we have a problem?
Yes.
Yeah, so we're 2 months behind on rent. In my experience, if they get 2 months behind, they're never catching up. 1 month, maybe. It's even rare if they catch up with 1 month. But 2 months, you can forget it as a property manager. That's just, take it for what it's worth, been there and done that. So, we're 2 months behind. So, my options here are to go file for summary ejectment. Now, when I go to the county courthouse, I'm going to have to pay $400 to file that action. That's a court action. You have to pay court fees to file it. I got to pay another $50 to have her served the summons for that action. So I'm spending $450 to file the court action to get her out. Does that make sense? You follow me so far? And how long did I say it's actually going to take to get her out?
45.
Another 45 days. Now, when she gets that summons, is she going to pay me from that point forward? No, because she knows what? Because she's getting evicted anyway. At that point, even if she had an intention of paying me, she's not going to pay. And so, because at that point, not only does she owe me the 2 months rent, she owes me the $450 I just spent at the courthouse and probably some fees for my time and all kinds. Does that make you follow me on this thing? It balloons, right? All of a sudden, she owes me $2,500 just to stay in there, and she's not going to come up with it. Most tenants don't. If I wait 45 days, is it still $2,500 she owes? Or is she another month behind on the rent? If not 2 months, month and a half, right? So now it's $4,000. Is she going to be happy on the way out?
Absolutely.
When the sheriff comes to evict her? Is she likely to leave the property in good condition? No, because she's pissed off, right? You're mad. That's the way it works. That is not a good outcome. Sometimes doing the most counterintuitive thing is a better outcome. as soon as she got 2 months behind, I would visit Tidra, and I would knock on her door, and I would say the following to her. And this is me as a property manager. Tidra, you know you're 2 months behind on the rent. What are the odds of you getting caught up? Be honest with me. And she's going to say, not real good, right? I said, I tell you what, if you can be out in a week, I will refund your security deposit in full, forgive the rent that's not paid, and write you a check for your security deposit back in full, as long as you're out in a week and the property is spotlessly clean. Now, a lot of landlords hear that and say, I'm not giving her that security deposit. She owes me that security. Does she owe that security deposit?
Absolutely.
Of course. But again, at the end of the day, what's going to be the better result? Wait 45 more days and have her trash the place because she's in a bad mood and she's having to scramble to get out, or give her some incentive to leave on her own, have them, and by the way, I'll give you a good reference. Or at least won't give you a bad one. Would that provide incentive for that tenant to move out?
Yes.
And is that going to be a better result for the landlord? So what I want you to think of is, just because the summary ejectment process is the legal mechanism to do this, the best way is always going to be to convince the tenant to do it willingly. And sometimes that means just giving them their money back, because that's a better result than having them stay another month and a half and do damage to the property. Okay? I always did that as a property manager as well. But no self-help eviction. Make sure you know you're not doing that.
Did it work?
Yes,
It did work.
it did. I only had one time where I couldn't get the tenant to leave voluntarily.
So what you got to do?
I had to go through summary ejectment.
Oh, man.
Yeah, we went through the summary ejectment
Why
process.
wouldn't they
I thought by that point you
They didn't have anywhere to go. It was a unique circumstance. The main reason it didn't work is because the previous property manager had only collected a $300 security deposit from them. I took the property over from a previous property manager. The tenant had been in there for a long period of time, and the rent was $700 a month, but they had only collected a $300 security deposit. So I really didn't have much to leverage. There was not much incentive there, and it just wasn't, it wasn't. They basically felt that they needed to squeeze whatever time they could out of that place because they were going to be homeless after that. They just didn't. I mean, I think he didn't have the income to really qualify for renting somewhere else, and he clearly couldn't afford this place, and it was just it was not a good situation, but it was the only way to, and this is the thing you have to know about residential property management. It's the reason I don't do it. You have to be cold as ice to do that job, because that's what you were hired for.
They signed
Remember that the landlord most of the time brought you in after they already had a bad experience themselves. Most landlords don't start out with property managers because they hear, why would I give 10% to somebody just to collect rent every month, until they find out how hard it is to collect rent. And they don't want to be the one beating on somebody's door and telling them you can't buy Christmas presents for your kids, or you can't buy a birthday gift for your son, or because you got to pay the rent. They don't want to do that. See, because they're tenderhearted, right? But their tenderheartedness goes completely away when they hire you, because they expect you to be the mean one. They don't care that you're mean. They just don't want to do it themselves. And the thing of it is that's your job now. You don't get to make that, sort of judgment call and be like, oh, I'll let you slide. No, you were hired to do a job. You are falling down on your job if you don't press ahead. And so I just never had the heart for it. Over time it wore on me. And it was not something I enjoyed. Plus, I just did not like the constant calls. Somebody calls you on Thanksgiving Day. We got an emergency. Well, what is it? The toilet won't flush. None of them? No, the one downstairs. You got 4 toilets in the house. That is not an emergency. Especially not on Thanksgiving. Well, my family's over here. Then send them upstairs. You know? I'm sorry, but that is not an emergency. I am not getting a plumber over there on Thanksgiving Day because you got a toilet down. Do you have someone in the house that's handicapped? They can't do the stairs? No, they're all fine. Then send them upstairs, you know? It's just, you know.
Do not disturb.
I'm sorry?
Do not disturb.
Do not disturb. Yeah, you can't do that as a property manager because you never know when it is a real problem. You know,
You're on call 24/7.
you are on call 24/7 because you take over that legal responsibility of the landlord to maintain the property. So, and plumbing leaks never happen at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. It's always 3 o'clock in the morning. You know, 15 degrees outside. I mean, always with water. I don't know what it is with water in the middle of the night, but you know, I never once in my career have had a plumbing leak in the daytime. You know, always happen in the middle of the night. We talk about tenants needing protection at foreclosure. Remember, foreclosure is not the tenant's fault. And when the market meltdown happened in 2008 and 2009, a lot of tenants got caught in really ugly situations because a lot of tenants were leasing properties, were current on their rent, had no idea that the landlord wasn't making the mortgage payment, and would then get a notice from the sheriff that said they had to be out in 10 days because the property had been foreclosed on. Because that was the law in North Carolina at that point in time, that tenants only had to be given 10 days notice. So North Carolina passed the Protecting Tenants at Foreclosure Act. And here's what it does. It says that if the tenant has what they call a bona fide lease. A bona fide basically means it's in writing and there's nothing funky going on with it. It can't be for like $1 a month, and it can't be I'm leasing it to my sister type thing. You know, it has to be a real honest to goodness lease. But if it's a real honest to goodness lease and it's in writing, then the bank that's foreclosing on the property has to honor that lease. That the tenant gets to stay. Is everybody okay on that? So when that foreclosure action happens and that property is sold, the tenant stays there just like any other sale.
For the length of their lease?
For the length of their lease.
Wow.
For the length of their lease. Unless the only time there's an exception to that is if the person buying it at the foreclosure sale is going to occupy it as a primary residence, and that's that last bullet point here, then it's 90 days. The tenant gets 90 days notice. So for example, if we have a situation where the property goes into foreclosure, and let's say Josh goes and bids on it at the county courthouse and he's buying it, he plans to live there, then as soon as that foreclosure auction is over, he could give the tenant 90 days notice. Even if they have, say, 6 months left on their lease, he could give them 90 days notice and they'd have to move out. But that's only if he intends to occupy it as his residence. If he was going to lease it out to somebody else, then he couldn't do it. He'd have to honor the full term of the lease. All right? So at worst case scenario, they're going to get 90 days. Which is
That's a lot better than
vastly
10.
better than 10. And usually speaking, what this has actually done is made it even better for the tenant. Because the banks don't want to be landlords. They don't want that legal responsibility. What they have started to do is what we call cash for keys. A lot of times the banks will come in, and as soon as the foreclosure is processed, they will visit with the tenant and offer to give the tenant a full refund of their security deposit plus $1,000 if they'll leave. And just say, you know, will you vacate the property? It's sort of the same conversation I'm talking about earlier. Basically, can we pay you to leave? Because they would rather do that and just take the loss than have the legal responsibility of having a tenant in there while they're trying to sell the property. All right? The Security Deposit Act. We regulate in North Carolina how tenant security deposits are held. The Security Deposit Act limits where it's held and what we do with it. The first thing you need to know about security deposits in North Carolina is that they must always be held in a trust or escrow account. This is not a rule for real estate brokers. This is a rule, period. This is a law. This is what we call a general statute. There's a difference between commission rules and general statutes. Commission rules only apply to people who have a real estate license. License law applies to people who have a real estate license. But general statutes apply to who?
Everybody.
Everybody. So the Tenant Security Deposit Act is a North Carolina general statute, and it says that tenant security deposits must always be held in a trust or escrow account. So that means anybody who's renting out a property in this state, if you hold a tenant security deposit, what kind of account do you have to maintain?
Trust.
You got to maintain a trust account. Remember, we talked about those rules of a trust account. That means it has to be completely separate from your own money. It has to be clearly identified on all the checks, deposit slips, statements as a trust account, and you've got to balance it according to the rules of managing a trust account. How many people do you think break this law every day?
Plenty.
Plenty. Here's the problem. Here's going to be the penalty for them. It's all well and good as long as the tenant doesn't contest anything. But let's say the tenant stops paying rent and the landlord evicts them for it. Normally, would the landlord get to keep the security deposit to help cover the unpaid rent?
Yes.
Yeah. If that tenant raises their hand in court and says, Your Honor, ask them what trust account they have my tenant security deposit in. You know what the judge is going to say when they find out it's not in a trust account? Or the magistrate?
Goes back to the tenant.
Refund it. Even if you're legally entitled to it otherwise, if you don't hold it in a trust account, you have no legal entitlement. Does that make sense for you? So the risk you take by not holding it in a trust account is that you really don't have any legal right to it
Right.
by holding it that way. So you're taking a big risk by not putting it in a trust account. Obviously for us, we're taking an even bigger risk because we could also be disciplined by the Real Estate Commission if we broke that law. All right? How much? How much can we hold? That's going to be dictated by the length of the lease. If we have just like the notice requirements, remember, the longer the lease was for, the longer notice you had to give, right? In this case, the longer the lease is for, the more of a security deposit you're allowed to hold. So these are not minimums. Remember, the notice was minimum. These are what?
Limits.
These are limits or maximums, exactly. So, for a week-to-week tenancy, what's the most security deposit we can hold?
2 weeks.
2 weeks. For month-to-month,
1.5 months.
month and a half, and for anything longer than month-to-month, the biggest security deposit you can ever ask for in North Carolina, 2 months rent. Never more than 2 months rent. Why do you think it's important to limit the amount of a security deposit? Why not just let the tenant and landlord sort it out? Well, they'll try, but I mean, you would think they can negotiate, right? Folks, landlord and tenant law has a very ugly history of discriminatory activity. Tenant security deposits were one of the primary mechanisms by which discriminatory activity was accomplished, because it's very easy to interview 2 tenants and tell one, oh, well, we charge a 1 month security deposit, and interview the next one and say, oh, well, it's 6 months security deposit. Sure, we'd be glad to take you, but it's a 6 month security deposit. See how that might be a deterrent? So, they're limited like that for a reason, so that landlords do not have the freedom to essentially shut people out of a property by making the security deposit unreasonably high. That's where these laws come from. Wish that was not the case, but that's where they come from. So what can we do with that security deposit? We limit where we can hold it. We limit how much we can hold. The Security Deposit Act also limits what you can do with it. So these are the things that we are allowed to deduct from the security deposit. Now, as a landlord, this is the one time, or as an escrow agent. Escrow agent just means somebody who's managing what? A trust account. What kinds of funds would potentially be in an escrow account? Security deposits, what else? Rent, what else? Not due diligence fees. Earnest money deposits, right? Where would a due diligence fee go?
To the buyer.
Directly to the seller, right?
The
So
seller.
earnest money deposits, rent, tenant security deposits. With earnest money deposits, when do we disperse them? Mutual
Or
agreement, court order, or
if they are canceled before their due diligence, it goes back to.
no. We wait for a mutual agreement then. What's the third
I said
reason?
before the due diligence. Oh, yeah.
Doesn't
yeah,
matter,
that
we
is
still wait
true.
for a mutual agreement. Closing.
Oh, yeah.
Closing is the third reason. With a tenant security deposit, it's only closing. And when is closing? When the tenant does what?
Moves in.
Not in.
Move
Out.
Moves
Out.
Oh, yeah, moves out.
Moves out. When the tenant vacates the property, we do not touch that money. So even if the tenant has done something that shows up on this list, you still cannot touch their security deposit until they've actually vacated the property. Yes, we can deduct unpaid rent from the security deposit, but if they're a month behind on the rent, can we take the security deposit to make up for it? No, not until the tenant is what? Gone. You don't touch it until they've gone. So unpaid rent, damage to the property that's above ordinary wear and tear, and we're going to talk about what that is. What do you think? Give me some examples of things that would constitute ordinary wear and tear, do you think?
Carpet cleaning.
Carpet cleaning is ordinary wear and tear. That is not damage.
Right.
So you cannot deduct that from a security deposit. What else? Paint
Depends.
is damage.
Really?
Unauthorized paint.
Okay.
So if they don't get your permission to paint, you can deduct the cost of repainting from the tenant security deposit. Alright? How about like hanging pictures on the wall? Is that going to be damage or is that going to be ordinary wear and tear, you think?
Ordinary.
That's ordinary wear and tear. How about big holes in the walls like you mounted a TV on the wall? That's damage. So there are going to be differentiations between, but I tell you one thing you should never deduct from a security deposit unless it is just so far out of line it's crazy. Dirtiness. Because what the law actually says is you can only charge for it if it is excessive filth. And if you're going to deduct for that from a security deposit, you better have detailed pictures of what that filth looks like in case the tenant challenges you. Because like cleaning the stove, that's not excessive filth. Stains on the carpet, or, not stains, but dirty carpet, that is not excessive filth. Right? Those are not things that you can charge against a security deposit. Can you have a lease where it says the tenant will pay for the carpets to be cleaned when they moved out?
Yes.
Yes. Can you take that money out of their security deposit?
No.
No, that's the difference here. You can bill them for it if you have a lease that says they have to pay for that. But you can never deduct that kind of a thing from their security deposit. You're not allowed to. Does it happen all the time?
Yeah.
Of course it does. Because the tenants don't know the law. And they don't know to challenge, to push back. Because who's actually deciding what to deduct? The landlord is, right? The landlord's the one holding the security deposit. Tenant moves out, and the landlord sends them a letter, says, well, we had to deduct $200 for cleaning the carpet from your security deposit. What do most tenants say?
Okay.
Oh, well, okay.
What if they smoked inside the house?
So, we have never gotten clear direction on that. There's actually been some disagreement with different magistrates in the state that, smell from smoking, some say that's damage and some say that's ordinary wear and tear. We don't have any clear delineation on that.
Unless you say no smoking in the lease.
You could say no smoking in the lease, and if you do, then obviously they would be violating the terms of the lease by smoking in there, But I would say if you're going to say no smoking, I would set up a specific penalty for the no smoking. That way there's no question about, can you deduct it and that sort of thing. All right? So, breaking the lease, so moving out early, we call that non-fulfillment. Cost of cleanup and storage, if they leave a lot of junk in the property, the cost of cleaning. Here's another rule for you. Keep their junk for 10 days after they move out. Don't touch it. Because you're required by law to store it for 10 days. So yes, you can clean it out of the property, but who wants to clean it out and move it and have to put it in a storage unit and hold it for 10 days? Because we know ultimately where it's going, right? Where? in the dumpster. Exactly. Never leave anything you won't. Ultimately, it's going. So my rule of thumb. Here's what I used to tell people: say, "Well, I'm in a hurry to turn the property over." I said, "Well, then just move everything to one room. Couldn't you move all their stuff to one room and then clean up the rest of the place and repaint and work around that, so that the 10 days that stuff stays in the place in case they happen to show back up on day 9, and then on day 11 you could clean out the last room." But my advice is always just to leave it there. We used to just go check, make sure the property was secure, walk through, take notes of what needed to be done, and then wait 10 days and come back and clean it out. That was kind of the way we handled it, to make sure that there was, unless it was completely empty. Sometimes they do leave it cleaned out and then you knew you were good, but most of the time they leave party gifts.
Is that in the lease or is that just the law?
That is state law. State law that any tenant possessions have to be held and stored for 10 days. Okay? Cost of re-renting the property after the tenant breaches the lease. So if the tenant moves out early, again, so like the cost of marketing, if you have to put it in a newspaper, if you need to put it on, hotpads.com or, some website, that cost could be deducted from the tenant security deposit if they have breached the lease. One thing about breaching the lease, it says here for non-fulfillment of rent or non-fulfillment of the lease, breaking the lease. You can't charge the tenant for time that another tenant's paying for. What the law says is that the landlord has to make a diligent effort to re-rent the property in the event the tenant moves out early. They can't re-rent the property, get rent from the new tenant, and deduct from the security deposit of the old tenant for that same period of time. They're not allowed to get paid twice for the same period of time. Does that make sense for you guys? Mm-hmm. So if you, say for example, you're holding a 2-month security deposit and the tenant moves out and you're going to deduct the whole 2 months, but 30 days in you have a new tenant move in, you're going to have to refund 1 month of that security deposit because you can't keep that money and have a new tenant in there paying rent.
But if the old tenant doesn't know this,
there it is, if the old tenant doesn't know. So who's going to have to pay attention and see what's going on? Is going to have to be the tenant. Exactly. What else, one of the things I've told people in the past, so well, I'm going to have to pay 2 months if I breach if I move out. Because you get this a lot with real estate. Because people look at buying houses and they look at, well, I've got 6 months left on my lease, and we have this discussion quite often. I say, well, what does the rental market look like around you? Because what does the rental market look like for most people around here?
Expensive.
It's expensive, super hot, it's hard to find a place, right?
Mm-hmm.
What I always ask them is, do you know somebody who'd be willing to move into your place at your rent that you're paying right now? And most often after a week or so, they were like, yeah, I think I do. I said, then go have that conversation with the landlord. Offer, you've got a tenant who's willing to move into your property in exactly its current condition, and put that in writing and give it to the landlord. Because then when you move out, they have no legal entitlement whatsoever to charge you for breaking that lease early, because you have presented them with an alternative.
Do they have to accept that?
Well, if the tenant meets their criteria, I mean that's
Okay.
assuming the tenant meets their criteria. But if the tenant, so what some apartment managers would try to do is they would put that tenant in a different apartment and say yours is still vacant. They are not allowed to do that, especially if you bring them the tenant and say this person wants to take over my lease. When you present them with that ability, then they have to allow you to do that, as long as the tenant meets their criteria.
Okay.
Does everybody follow with that? Okay.
So would you say landlords just don't know this stuff, or they know it and they're still?
A lot don't know it. A lot do know it, and they take advantage. I mean, I use this as an example. It's an old example now, because it's been 10 years since I rented an apartment. But when I first sold my house in Chapel Hill and moved over here to Wake County, I lived for 2 years in an apartment while I was deciding where I wanted to buy. And that was miserable, going from a house back to an apartment.
Sure.
And I was so ready to get back out into a house. But when I moved out of the apartment, they had it was called valet waste. Basically, they came and picked your trash up at the door of the apartment. They had a trash can that you would sit outside your door and put your trash in it, and they would come pick the trash up. When we moved out, when they sent my tenant security deposit back, they had a $75 deduction on it because they said that we didn't return the can. Well, we left the can in the apartment. I mean, why would I want somebody's black trash can with somebody's name stamped on the side? I mean, it was just a, you know, and I didn't complain one bit. I copied the Tenant Security Deposit Act out of the general statutes, and I sent a copy of it to them, and it simply said, please show me in the statute where you're allowed to deduct from a tenant security deposit for a trash can. And 3 days later, I got a certified letter with a $75 check. Sorry for our oversight. So in that case, I'm pretty sure they knew exactly what they were doing, and as soon as they had somebody push back, it was just automatic to give them the money. So I think there are genuinely cases where landlords don't know. And I think there are genuinely cases where landlords do know and take advantage. Of course, there are also tenants that take advantage too. It works both ways. It works both ways. I've seen both. But again, like I said, the most protected group of consumers in the state is the residential tenant. So when you go into this, you have to understand there are tons of laws protecting residential tenants, and you've got to know how to navigate them. All right? Once the tenant does move out, we have to give them an accounting of what we've done with their security deposit. And an accounting would include a refund if we didn't keep their, you know, so are we refunding the whole thing? Are we keeping the whole thing? Or are we refunding some portion of it? That has to happen within 30 days of the tenant vacating the property. You have to send it to them. And I've had people often say, well, where do I send that? You send it to their last known address. Well, that's my house. Well, then send it there. That's not your fault that they didn't get their mail forwarded, right? But that doesn't excuse you from having to send it, because guess what? If they pop up on day 35 and say, you never sent me an accounting, you can't keep the money because you didn't follow the law. So keep it in a in a trust account, and send them an accounting within 30 days after they move out. Now, if for some reason you can't get numbers within 30 days, like say they did do damage to the property, and you're still waiting for pricing, you can send them an estimate on day 30, but a final breakdown by 60 days. But you have to, that's pretty rare. You really need to have done this by 30 days. You got to send them something by 30 days. Even if you're waiting for the 60-day window, you're waiting for the estimates, on day 30 you still have to send them an estimate and say what you're waiting for. So you got to send something out by day 30, okay? All right. What is damage? What is ordinary wear and tear? We kind of talked about this a little bit. Examples of wear and tear: dirty or worn carpet is not damage, that's wear and tear. Peeling, cracked, or faded paint. So the paint is peeling. That is ordinary wear and tear, because that's the landlord's to maintain. But then if you look down in the damage, it says unauthorized paint. So if they have painted the home without your permission, you can charge a security deposit to paint it back. That's the moral to the story there. Frayed curtains and blinds would be an example of ordinary wear and tear. Some examples of damage: drawings on the wall, large holes, stains, broken windows, broken fixtures, and excessive filth.
Is there like a definition for excessive filth? Because that could be subjective.
Very subjective, and that's why I say you better have good pictures. If you're gonna make the claim of excessive filth, you better have really good documentation so that you can show the magistrate exactly why you viewed this as being excessive filth. And again, that's only going to matter if the tenant pushes back. But you can't wait until the tenant pushes back, because by that time it's too late to take the pictures. You know, if you send the tenant a statement saying we kept all your security deposit because you left the place filthy, and then the next week you get a notice to appear in Wake County Court because the tenant wants their security deposit back, what are you going to do? Walk in there and say, well, Your Honor, it was dirty. What are they going to ask you for? Proof. I mean, you're the one taking somebody's money, so you're the one with the burden of proof here. So, again, document this kind of thing. What I always did as a residential property manager was to do a move-in, move-out checklist. We'd go through, take pictures from multiple angles of every room before the tenant moved in. And then I would print those out and have a checklist for for the tenant to walk through the property. Now, whether they walk through or not, I don't know, and I don't care. But they had to initial every page along with those pictures that this is the condition of the property when I moved in. And then when they moved out, guess what? Take the same pictures from the same angles so that we got documentation of if there is damage to the property.
That was something I did before I bought my house when I lived in apartments. I took pictures before I moved in, and when I moved out, I took pictures.
It's a good
also.
protection for the tenant too. As a tenant, you should always do that, especially if you're moving into a property that does have some things going on with it. You know, you want to be able to show, well, it was like that when I got here. So I think it's a good idea for both parties to do that. And then finally, the last thing here in Chapter 11, the Vacation Rental Act. And this is over on page 339? 38. The Vacation Rental Act in North Carolina. How long do we say it takes to evict people? Summary judgment. 45 days, right? Would that be kind of cumbersome if you were renting this beach house right here? Would that be tough? Because you probably got all kinds of other reservations stacked up and all kinds of things. So, we have a law that basically exempts vacation rental properties from a lot of the protections that go with regular residential properties. Does that make sense? Here's what it does. It says this is a vacation rental. You don't need 45 days to get out. You get out today. Because, as the old expression goes, you ain't got to go home, but you got to get out of here, right? And the key there is you have a home to go to because this is a vacation rental. So what you need to know about the Vacation Rental Act is basically just what the rules are to qualify it as a vacation rental. In order to be qualified as a vacation rental in North Carolina, and so in order to be able to kick tenants out same day, because that's really what the advantage here is, to be able to say, you were supposed to be out at 2 o'clock today, it's 3 o'clock, out. And somebody said, well, how do you get them out? I said, well, remember when I told you shotgun eviction was not allowed? It is allowed here because they get, it's called expedited eviction, you know? So, in order to qualify as a vacation rental property, no tenant rents for more than 90 days. So you cannot ever lease for more than 90 days to a single tenant. That's rule number 1. And rule number 2 is that you have to verify that every single tenant that you do lease to has a home somewhere else. So you would ask for their driver's license and their home address type thing. You know, you need to verify that they have a home somewhere else. The idea being you can't kick them out on a day's notice if they don't have somewhere else to go. But if they have another home to go to and this is a vacation property, it shouldn't matter. That's why you can legally do this. So if you're going to want to rent out a property like this, then make sure that you follow those rules. Don't ever lease it to any single tenant for more than, and this becomes, that 90-day rule is tough at the coast. They hate this at the coast because they get snowbirds. They get people that come down during the winter months, especially when the properties are cheap down there, and they'll want to rent these things from October through like March. And they should not do that, because if they do that, not only is it not a vacation rental for that person, it's not a vacation rental for any of those other people that you've got reservations for, because you've lost the ability to call it a vacation rental, period. Does that make sense for everybody?
Right.
So it's really dangerous to go more. Now, I've seen people rent it for 90 days and then make them leave for a day and come back. You know, there are property managers at the coast who will let them do that. They'll say, well, you know, you can put your stuff in the garage and, you know, you got to go to a hotel for a day and then you can come back and do a new lease for 2 more months. I guess that's fine. I guess. I mean, clearly they're trying to work around the law, but if you ever do manage vacation rental property, make sure that you understand 90 days or less and they have to have a home somewhere else. That's the Vacation Rental Act in North Carolina. That's a pretty picture, isn't it?
That's nice.
Makes me want to be at the beach.
Ain't Groundhog Day tomorrow?
No, tomorrow's the 1st.
When is it?
It's the 2nd. Groundhog Day is the 2nd.
And if you see the shadows.
I don't know the
spread them
rules.
early.
I don't know. That was a random question. Where'd that
Because
come
I
from?
thought about the beach and the next season and then Groundhog.
That's a weird connection you just made there. Alright, that's the end of chapter 11, so let's go ahead and take a break and we'll come back and we'll talk about property management, chapter 12.